welcome to the Literature Cafe, and today we are diving into one of the most fundamental questions in moral philosophy, and this question is, what ought I to do? And for Kant, this question is inseparable from action itself. To be human means to act, and our lives are an endless series of decisions, and even when we try to let life pass without making decisions, that in itself is a decision, the decision not to decide. But how do we know which actions are the right ones? So for Kant, the critique of practical reason, he attempts to provide a universal guide for moral action. So something he sees essential for human coexistence. And therefore, Kant begins by distinguishing between two essential functions of reason. So the theoretical reason and the practical reason. And the theoretical reason is concerned with acquiring knowledge that can be definitely proven, so just like the laws of mathematics. Whereas the practical reason, on the other hand, guides our actions. So it helps us establish moral principles or laws that direct how we should act. And while these principles aren't provable in the same way as scientific facts, Kant argues that they can still claim absolute validity. And then he also further explains the difference between understanding and reason by saying, in the first part of our transcendental logic, we defined the understanding as the faculty of rules. Here we will distinguish reason from understanding by calling reason the faculty of principles. So in simpler terms, understanding is about following established rules, whereas reason is concerned with creating the principles that justify those rules. And practical reason, therefore, goes beyond merely following norms, and it helps us determine the principles that shape our decision. And one of Kant's famous claims is that nothing in the world is indeed nothing even beyond the world can possibly be conceived which could be called good without qualification except a good will. But what does he actually mean by that? So Kant argues that things like intelligence, courage, or perseverance are very valuable, but they can also be very dangerous if not guided by good will. So even things we typically see as positive, like wealth or power, can lead to harm if they aren't backed by a good moral foundation. So the good will is like a compass that keeps the qualities in check, making sure they are used ethically. And then you could also ask yourself, okay, is then reason good? And Kant would say no, because for example, a sharp intellect could also be easily used to plan something like a crime. So what really matters for Kant is not the outcome of an action, but the intention behind it. So a good will is good in itself. So regardless of if the action succeeds or fails. So even though we might not always be able to see someone's inner motive, Kant still insists that it's the good will that forms the basis of any moral action. So a central part of Kant's philosophy is the concept of duty. So the decisions we make are guided by maxims, so the underlying principles that govern our will. And for Kant, the moral worth of an action is determined by the maxim behind the action. So Kant argues that acting from duty, so from the moral law, rather than personal interest or inclination, is the highest form of moral action. And he's actually very critical of ethical systems that focus on emotions or personal desires, famously calls them disgusting mishmash. And for Kant, moral action is elevated when it is rooted in duty, so transcending personal feelings or social pressure. But Kant's enthusiasm for duty actually also goes beyond intellectual rigor, and it's almost poetic. So when many of us might think of duty as a burden, so some obligation, often accompanied by the image of a wagging finger, Kant speaks of duty with admiration. So in the Critique of Practical Reason, he writes, "Duty, sublime and mighty name, that requires submission. What origin is there worthy of you, and where is to be found the root of your noble descent, which rejects all kinship with the inclinations, descent from which is the indispensable condition of that worth which human beings alone can give themselves?" So for Kant, acting out of duty gives humans moral dignity, and it lifts us beyond self-interest and grounds our actions in universal moral law. And by following duty, we transcend the mere animal instinct and connect with something much greater, the moral law that binds all rational beings. And now the heart of Kant's moral philosophy comes into play, the categorical imperative, which he famously formulates as, "So act that the maxim of your will could always hold at the same time as a principle in the giving of universal law." So in simpler terms, Kant is saying that we should act only according to principles that could be adopted universally. So principles that everyone could follow without any contradiction. And if a maxim cannot be universalized, it is not morally valid. So take lying for example. So imagine you lied to get out of trouble, and now you ask yourself, what if everyone lied whenever it was convenient? And the result would be that trust would break down and society wouldn't function. And therefore lying is morally wrong because it can't be universalized. But how did Kant actually come up with the idea of the categorical imperative? And that was one afternoon, so during one of his famous walks. So Kant observed swallows throwing their young out of the nest due to a lack of food. And he was actually so fascinated by the reason-like instinct that guided these animals with such certainty and precision in their actions. And reflecting on this, Kant writes, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the oftener and the more steadily we reflect on them, the starry heavens above and the moral law within." So this experience led Kant to search for a similarly dependable moral law for humans. And this law shouldn't be based on instincts like the swallows, but grounded in reason. So just as animals are naturally guided by instincts, Kant sought for humans to be guided by moral principles that reason could establish with the same clarity and certainty. But Kant didn't develop this ethical system in isolation. He first examined and critiqued already existing ethical frameworks, finding many of them insufficient. So let's take a closer look at how Kant critiques four major ethical approaches, so the hedonism, utilitarianism, eudaimonism, and the legalism. And we will do this with an example. So imagine someone wants to divorce their spouse because they found someone else more appealing. And let's see how different ethical systems would handle this situation. Critique of hedonism, pleasure as the ultimate good. So when I consider whether a new partner would enhance my enjoyment of life, this ethical perspective is known as hedonism. So hedonism suggests that the good is defined by pleasure, and Kant critiques hedonism for being very subjective, because what brings pleasure to one person may harm another. So a hedonistic principle cannot be universalized because it would lead to conflicting and chaotic moral outcomes. A principle that is based only on the subjective condition of receptivity to pleasure can never furnish a practical law. Critique of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. On the other hand, if I believe that a new partner would benefit my career and therefore decide to divorce, I align myself with the second ethical framework, utilitarianism. And in this view, actions are evaluated based on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And Kant criticized utilitarianism for allowing the majority's interests to outweigh those of individuals. And he insists that each person must be treated as an end and not merely as a means. Every rational being exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will. Critique of eudaimonism, virtue alone is not enough. So when the justification for divorce depends on whether the decision promotes the person's overall flourishing, then it is based on eudaimonism. So if staying in the marriage prevents one from living a virtuous or fulfilling life due to, for instance, emotional or intellectual dissatisfaction, divorce might be a step toward deeper and more lasting happiness. So eudaimonism, rooted in Aristotle's philosophy, emphasized that true happiness comes from living virtuously rather than pursuing fleeting pleasure. So a divorce could be justified if it leads to long-term well-being. And in the beginning, I already explained that Kant said that only the good will in itself is good, and because virtues can be misused. Courage, resolution, and perseverance can be extremely evil and harmful if the will is not good. Critique of legalism, laws can be unjust. And then there's the fourth ethic, and in this case I believe I'm not allowed to divorce because it is written, for instance, in the Bible. And here my ethical behavior is dictated by an external command or prohibition. So this might be also true when someone would justify their actions by saying they were only following orders from above. So for instance, when it's like a soldier or an official. And by doing so, one seemingly relinquishes their personal responsibility. And that's also actually what Kant critiques, because he says that legalism is just blindly following external laws without applying rational consideration. And for Kant, true morality comes from autonomous decision-making and not from obedience to external authorities. A supreme moral law must be something we generate autonomously by ourselves. So for Kant, the only valid motivation for moral action is duty and the submission of our free will to the categorical imperative. So after examining and rejecting these other ethical systems, where does Kant then lead us? So he offers the categorical imperative as the one true moral law. And this law is not dependent on personal feelings, societal norms, or external authorities. So unlike animals, which act on instinct, humans can act according to reason and moral principles. Everything in nature works in accordance with laws. Only a rational being has the capacity to act in accordance with principles or has a will. So returning now to the dilemma of divorce, Kant would argue that being drawn to someone else is driven by personal inclination, which does not qualify as a moral motivation. So according to his ethics, one should remain committed to one's spouse, even when personal feelings change. And this at the same time highlights the inner conflict between duty and emotion, as Kantian ethics demands that we prioritize reason and moral obligation over fluctuating desires. But while the emotional struggle is real, Kant's philosophy insists that true moral action lies in duty and not in personal inclination, even in matters of love. So this was Kant's critique of practical reason. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time in the Literature Cafe.